Under the scorching sun of the Mekong Delta, in May 1968, the Loc Ninh base near the Cambodian border felt like a steel forge. The air was thick, hot as the breath of a demon, making each inhale feel like swallowing burning sand. The ceiling fans in the tents spun furiously, blowing out blasts of stifling air, doing nothing to ease the suffocating heat, strangling everything. Sergeant Jake Malone, a green beret with sun-bronzed skin and eyes sharp as knives, dragged himself up from a rusty iron cot. Sweat poured, soaking his uniform, streaming down his spine. The night before, he'd stayed awake, ear glued to the radio, tracking scattered signals from an Sarge recon team slipping deep into enemy territory. Now, with a head heavy as lead and a stomach growling in revolt, Jake dreamed of one thing: an MRE that didn't reek of the sardines he'd sworn never to touch again. Loc Ninh, a tiny Mass VSOG outpost, was a gathering place for the toughest soldiers, men for whom death was just a daily card game. They called it Satan's Playground. No McDonald's, no TV replaying football games, only endless jungle, mosquitoes buzzing like airplanes, and the distant sound of gunfire, a never-ending soundtrack. Jake, a tall Texan with sun-bleached blonde hair, was used to this brutal rhythm. He often joked that if Vietnam had a Super Bowl, he'd crush the competition with just the stench of his boots after a week patrolling the jungle. That quip always made his comrades roar with laughter, but today Jake's smile didn't show. Something in the air, a creeping unease, slithered through, as if the jungle whispered warnings only spirits could hear. Jake shuffled out of the tent, his heavy boots stomping the parched earth. His 8-inch buck recon knife swayed at his hip, its cold steel blade a loyal companion through countless battles. He headed toward the mess hall, daydreaming of a cup of coffee that didn't taste like burnt motor oil. In his mind, a hot Big Mac appeared like a luxurious fantasy, but reality offered only an MRE packet labeled meal ready to endure. Still, Jake didn't complain. He'd learned to survive whatever the army threw at him, from storms of bullets to packaged meals that made his stomach want to mutiny. On his way, a gentle sound cut through his thoughts. Amid the base's chaos, an outdoor Catholic service unfolded under sparse tree cover. The chaplain, with a warm, steady voice, recited prayers, and soldiers knelt around him, heads bowed in rare silence. Jake, a devout Catholic, paused. He removed his cap, revealing sweat-matted hair, and stood quietly at the crowd's edge. The prayers rose, a cool breeze in the furnace of war, soothing his soul. "The Lord bless you," the chaplain concluded, raising his hand in a blessing. Jake nodded in respect, a simple but reverent gesture, then continued on. The mess hall wasn't far, and his stomach was screaming for its due. But before he'd gone a few steps, a whirlwind broke across the dusty red path. 2 pilots sprinted past, running as if chased by demons, faces pale, sweat streaming. They didn't glance at Jake, didn't say a word, just charged toward the helicopter pad where rotors were starting to whine. Jake turned, brows furrowed, his heart beat faster, a bad feeling rising. Those pilots weren't running to make lunch. Something was happening. The operations center, where radios always crackled with battlefield updates, was surely in an uproar. Jake abandoned his coffee dream and strode toward the command tent. His steps were heavy, not from the heat or hunger, but from the instinct of a seasoned soldier who knew war always held deadly surprises. As he pushed through the tense canvas flap, the radio blared like a scream from hell. "Daniel Boone is getting shredded. a voice shouted over the airwaves, mixed with gunfire and explosions. Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. Daniel Boone was the code name for an SOG recon team, battlefield phantoms even death hesitated to touch. If they were calling for help on the guard channel, the emergency frequency only the desperate used. The situation wasn't just bad, it was a nightmare. Jake caught fragments about downed helicopters, a obliterated aircrew, and distant screams. He forgot his hunger, forgot the heat. His eyes locked on the radio, as if he could see his comrades fighting through each crackling sound. Outside, the roar of helicopter rotors drowned out everything. Jake ran to the airstrip, where red dust swirled in clouds. Hueys were preparing to lift off, their blades slicing the air like giant knives. He stood there, breathing hard, watching other soldiers scramble. In his mind, memories from the previous week flooded back. He'd been pinned under enemy fire, his teammate Mike Carter shot in the face and back. Jake had called for rescue, and a helicopter dropped a nylon rope amid the bullet storm. The rope tangled, nearly burned, but Sergeant Tom Brady climbed down, untangled it, and saved them both. Now on the airstrip, Jake wondered who in Daniel Boone was calling for help. He muttered a prayer, a habit whenever war bared its claws. But deep inside, Jake felt something else. Not just worry for his comrades, but a strange sensation, as if the jungle out there was watching. The wind rustled through the canopy, carrying a sound not of the battlefield, a deep, chilling whisper like a warning from the unseen. Jake shook his head, telling himself it was just sleep deprivation, but the soul of a Green Beret, forged through countless battles, wasn't easily fooled. Something was waiting out there in the Mekong's dark shadows, and Jake knew today wouldn't end with a cup of coffee or an MRE. It would end in blood, smoke, and perhaps mysteries no one dared name. Under the blistering sun of the Mekong Delta, Loch Ninh Base reverberated with the sounds of war. Roaring helicopter rotors, soldiers shouting to one another, and radios screeching like trapped spirits. Sergeant Jake Malone, his boots caked with red dust, strode toward the operations center, his heart beating faster with each step. The May 1968 heat clung to him like a curse, sweat streaming down his sun-weathered face, but he paid it no mind. The instincts of a Green Beret, honed through countless battles, warned him that something was collapsing out there in the jungle's dark shadows. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The radio roared like a wounded beast. "Heavy contact with Daniel Boone!" A fractured voice crackled over the airwaves, mixed with deafening gunfire and explosions. "They're getting torn apart out there." Jake froze, his eyes narrowing, straining to catch every sound. Daniel Boone, the codename Nam, for an SOG recon team. Battlefield phantoms, elite soldiers who slipped across the Cambodian border as if death were a companion. They weren't the type to call for help, and their signal on the guard channel, the emergency frequency reserved for desperate moments, chilled Jake's blood. He caught fragments about 2 slick helicopters shot down during a rescue attempt, a gunship obliterated in smoke and fire. His hunger and heavy head vanished, replaced by a sharp pang of dread. Jake bolted from the tent, running toward the airstrip where red dust swirled like a small storm. Standing under the blinding sun, Jake watched the Hueys lined up, their rotors spinning furiously, ready to plunge into the fire. He breathed heavily, his hand gripping the buck recon knife at his hip, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. In that moment, memories from the previous week flooded back, sharp as a blade. He and his teammate, Mike Carter, had been pinned under enemy fire in a jungle corner where death stalked every second. Mike, face bloodied and back riddled with bullets, had nearly died. Jake had called for rescue, his voice hoarse over the radio. A helicopter appeared, dropping a nylon rope amid the bullet storm. The rope tangled, friction heating it to near burning. But Sergeant Tom Brady, not the NFL quarterback Jake once joked only knew how to throw balls, but a fearless Green Beret, climbed down, untangled it, and pulled them both to safety. Tom's action was a testament to the brotherhood Jake held sacred. Now, on the airstrip, he wondered who in Daniel Boone was fighting to survive. He muttered a prayer, as he did whenever war bared its claws, his lips moving silently. But before the prayer could finish, a piercing whine tore through the air. A damaged helicopter crashed onto the airstrip, its body scarred with bullet holes, black oil leaking like the blood of a wounded beast. Jake ran to it, heart pounding, dust coating his face. He climbed onto the wreckage, his hands trembling as he reached the pilot slumped in the seat. Blood poured from the young man's chest, soaking the metal floor. Jake knelt, trying to use his combat medic skills, but the pilot's eyes were fading, the light in them dimming. "Dad," he whispered, his voice faint as a final breath. Then his body went limp, his hand slipping from Jake's grasp. Jake held the pilot's hand tightly, his heart heavy as if crushed by a boulder. The man's dog tag revealed his name, Daniel Hayes, a kid barely 20, who likely once dreamed of returning home, watching football and eating burgers with friends. But war cared nothing for dreams. Jake stood, breathing hard, trying to shake the image of Daniel's lifeless eyes. He looked out at the airstrip where other helicopters roared, preparing to dive into the war zone. But something in the air made him shudder, not just the smell of blood and gunpowder, but a strange sensation as if the jungle beyond was watching. The wind rustled through the canopy, carrying a sound not of the battlefield, a deep, chilling whisper like a warning from the unseen. Jake shook his head, telling himself it was just sleep deprivation and the heat scrambling his mind. But the soul of a Green Beret, forged through countless battles, wasn't easily deceived. He turned back toward the operations center, where the radio still screamed with cries for help. "They've lost contact with Daniel Boone," an officer shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Jake knew that recon team was out there in the jungle, surrounded by enemy fire, possibly an entire NVA battalion. He thought of Tom Brady, who'd saved him, and wondered if Tom was among them. He wasn't sure, but his heart told him he couldn't stand idle. Jake marched toward a warming Huey, his boots pounding the earth. He carried nothing but his buck knife and a tiny bottle of Tabasco in his pocket, his secret weapon to make MREs less awful, as he'd joked with his team. But now there was no room for jokes about MREs or the Super Bowl. War was calling, and Jake Malone, with all the courage of a Texan soldier, was ready to answer. In that moment, as he stepped onto the helicopter, a cold gust swept through despite the suffocating heat. The whisper from the jungle sounded again, clearer, like a final warning. Jake gripped his knife, his eyes fixed on the endless green ahead. He didn't know what awaited, enemy fire, death, or something darker, lurking in the Mekong's shadows. But he knew one thing: his brothers were fighting out there, and he wouldn't let them face it alone. Under the blazing sky of the Mekong Delta, Loch 9 base shuddered with the roar of helicopter rotors and the screech of radios like trapped spirits. Sergeant Jake Malone, his sharp eyes framed by sun-bleached blonde hair, stood on the airstrip, his heart pounding like a war drum. The May 1968 heat enveloped him like a blanket of fire, but he paid it no heed. The cries for help from Daniel Boone, the battlefield phantoms, echoed in his mind, each sound a knife twisting in his chest. When the radio crackled with the order, "Greyhound 1, prepare to deliver fire," Jake didn't hesitate. He turned, seeing the helicopter's rotors begin to spin, slicing the air like giant blades. Without a second's thought, he grabbed a medical bag from the ground, the heavy canvas under his hand a reminder of the mission ahead. With a leap, he climbed aboard Greyhound 1, his breath ragged, ready to plunge into the storm. In the cockpit, Warrant Officer Ethan Walsh, with the half-joking, half-serious grin typical of young pilots, glanced at Jake through his aviator glasses. His voice cut through the engine's roar, asking if Jake wanted to be the door gunner, a dangerous role hanging between life and death to provide cover from above. Jake nodded, his heart pounding as if it might burst, but as he settled in, his back against the cold metal wall of the chopper, a deadly truth hit him. He carried no rifle, no ammo, no grenades. All he had was the medical bag, his 8-inch buck recon knife swinging at his hip, and a tiny bottle of Tabasco in his pocket, the secret weapon he'd jokingly claimed made MREs less horrific, as if a dash of spicy sauce could mask the stench of canned sardines. Jake shook his head, chuckling at his own recklessness. A Green Beret, trained to survive any situation, was charging into battle equipped no better than a schoolboy on a camping trip. The helicopter roared, soaring over the delta, leaving Lock 9 behind like a distant memory. Below, the jungle stretched like an endless green sea, its swaying canopy hiding deadly secrets. Jake peered through the cockpit window, his eyes locked on the horizon, where black smoke rose from a clearing like the breath of a waking demon. Ethan called over the radio, his voice calm but laced with tension. "RT Bravo, this is Greyhound 1. No response, only the sound of gunfire bursting like 4th of July fireworks, mixed with screams and the clash of metal. Ethan muttered, his tone darkening. "It's gonna be hot." Jake gripped the medical bag, his knuckles white. He knew hot didn't just mean the Mekong's heat, but the firestorm awaiting them, where enemy fire was as thick as mosquitoes in a swamp. As the helicopter descended, hovering just 15 feet above the ground, the air inside the cabin grew heavy as lead. Jake took a deep breath, the stench of gunpowder and engine oil filling his nose. He shoved the medical bag out the door, hearing a thud as it hit the ground. Without a moment's pause, he jumped after it, his body hurtling through the air, his boots slamming into the soft earth of the clearing. But in that instant, a bullet tore through his leg, a searing pain like a fire erupting, spreading through his body. Jake collapsed, red dust coating his face, but he clenched his teeth and staggered to his feet. He ran, or rather limped, toward the nearest brush where the faint shapes of his teammates flickered. An RPG exploded ahead, its deafening blast ringing in his ears. Shrapnel grazed his cheek, hot blood streaming down his chin. But Jake didn't stop. He crawled, hands clawing the dirt, eyes fixed on his goal, the recon team fighting to survive. Finally, he reached a thicket where Ryan O'Neill, an ISI recon soldier, lay slumped, blood soaking his uniform, his face pale as wax. Ryan was a tough guy, once joking. He could eat MREs for life without complaint. But now his eyes were clouded with pain and blood loss. Jake knelt, his hands trembling as he opened the medical bag, beginning to bandage Ryan's leg wound. He glanced around, searching for signs of the others. Ryan, though weak, pointed toward another thicket where the remaining survivors were hiding. Jake grabbed the radio from Ryan's hand, his fingers brushing dried blood, trying to connect with anyone still listening. But in that moment, a strange sound cut through the gunfire and explosions. It wasn't a shot, wasn't the wind rustling the trees, but a deep, hollow whisper, like a voice from the unseen, rising from the jungle's darkness. Jake froze, his breath rapid, hair standing on end. The whisper was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Not Vietnamese, not English, but an ancient, chilling language, as if the Mekong itself were speaking. He shook his head, telling himself it was a hallucination from stress and heat. But the soul of a Green Beret, forged through countless battles, wasn't easily fooled. He looked toward the jungle where black smoke curled like specters, and for a moment he thought he saw glowing red eyes flash between the trees, then vanish. Jake gripped his buck knife, his heart pounding. He didn't know what awaited: enemy fire, death, or something darker lurking deep in the forest's heart. But he knew one thing: his brothers were out there in this clearing, and he wouldn't let them fight alone. He turned back to Ryan, continuing to bandage, his hands moving quickly but precisely, as if each second were a race against death. The radio in his hand crackled, but no clear signal came through, only distant gunfire and screams. Jake looked up, seeing Greyhound 1 circling overhead, its rotors slicing the air, ready to unleash fire. He knew time was running out, but the whisper from the jungle still echoed in his mind, like a warning, a prophecy, or a curse. Jake tightened his grip on the medical bag, his eyes fixed on the brush ahead. The firestorm was coming, and he, with his knife and Tabasco, was the only one standing between his teammates and the darkness. The clearing in the heart of the Mekong jungle, May 1968, was a scene straight out of a Hollywood horror nightmare. Enemy bodies lay scattered across the red earth, blood seeping into the grass, mingling with swirling white phosphorus smoke that rose in choking clouds, burning as hot as a furnace, stinging the eyes and throats of anyone still breathing. Sergeant Jake Malone, his sun-weathered face caked with blood and dust, crawled through the tall grass, each movement a battle against the searing pain from the bullet in his leg. He dragged Ryan O'Neill and SOG recon soldier pale from blood loss, and Tony, an interpreter nearly unconscious, his body limp like a puppet with cut strings. Sweat and blood mixed, soaking Jake's uniform, but he paid it no mind. In his mind, one goal burned: get the living out of this inferno. Amid the smoke and gunfire, Jake caught sight of a familiar figure lying motionless under a bush. It was Tom Brady, the Green Beret sergeant who'd saved him the week before. The man Jake had teased for throwing lifelines instead of footballs. Now, Tom lay there, eyes wide and lifeless, dried blood crusted around his mouth. Tears welled in Jake's eyes, hot as the Mekong sun, but he clenched his jaw, swallowing the pain. War didn't allow him to stop and grieve. He knelt, his hands trembling as he reached into Tom's jacket, pulling out a packet of classified documents, papers that could determine the fate of an entire campaign. He tossed a smoke grenade, its explosion spewing a thick green cloud, signaling the helicopter circling above. The smoke curled upward, a silent plea for rescue amid the firestorm. The roar of Greyhound 1 cut through the air, its rotor slashing the wind as it swooped into the clearing. The door gunner, wielding an M60, laid down cover fire, bullets tearing into the distant tree line where enemy soldiers hid. Jake, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg, dragged Ryan and Tony toward the chopper, each step like walking on nails. He shoved them into the cabin where the crew's hands reached out, pulling them aboard. But as he moved to climb in, a 30mm round ripped through the air, piercing his back and exiting under his left armpit. Pain exploded as if a red-hot spear had impaled him, hurling him to the ground. Blood gushed, hot and wet, soaking his uniform, but Jake gritted his teeth, crawling to his feet. Over the radio, Warrant Officer Ethan Walsh's hoarse voice crackled, urging him to get out now. But Jake didn't listen. He turned back, eyes locked on Tom's body. No one gets left behind. That was a Green Beret's oath, one he'd keep even if it cost his life. With the last of his strength, Jake dragged Tom's heavy body toward the helicopter, each step a duel with death. He didn't see the enemy soldiers bursting from the grass, their AK-47s spraying the cockpit of Greyhound 1. Ethan, the young pilot with a reckless grin, slumped forward, blood splattering the windshield. The chopper lost control, spinning like a wounded beast, then crashed into the nearby trees. The screech of metal rang out, deafening, like war's primal scream. Black smoke billowed from the wreckage, and Jake, though bleeding like a fountain from his back, crawled to it, pulling survivors from the twisted heap. He dragged out 2 crew members, one recon soldier and another interpreter, all dazed and bloodied. With the last of his clarity, Jake organized them into 2 groups, taking cover behind dense bushes, now shredded by gunfire. Ryan, though gravely wounded, clung to the radio, his trembling fingers trying to call for air support. Jake knelt beside him, bandaging another fresh wound, his eyes scanning the clearing. White, phosphorus smoke still rose, mingling with the stench of blood and gunpowder, creating a suffocating atmosphere, as if they were fighting in the bowels of hell. But amid the smoke and blood, a strange sound rang out, clearer than ever. It wasn't gunfire, not the whir of rotors, but a deep, hollow whisper, like the voice of an entity not of this world. Jake's head snapped up, his heart racing. He glanced into the jungle, where the darkness seemed to shift. For a moment he saw, or thought he saw, a towering figure at least 12 feet tall, with glowing red eyes like burning coals, slipping into the shadows of the canopy. It didn't move like a human, but like a specter, gliding silently. "Just stress," Jake muttered, trying to convince himself, but his heart, forged through countless battles, disagreed. Something was in this jungle, something ancient, something watching them. He shook his head, pushing the terrifying image aside, focusing on the mission. Ryan, with what strength remained, kept calling for air support, his voice faint over the radio. Jake gripped his buck knife, fingers tightening on the handle as if it were an anchor, keeping him from being swept into the darkness. He looked out at the clearing where enemy and allied bodies lay intermingled, a tableau of death. The helicopter was destroyed, air support hadn't arrived, and the enemy, despite heavy losses, was tightening their noose. Jake knew time was running out. He thought of Tom, of the nights they'd sat by campfires at Fort Bragg, joking about who'd win in a fistfight with John Wayne. Now, Tom was gone, and Jake felt a void in his chest, as if war had stolen not just lives, but joyful memories. But the whisper from the jungle sounded again, closer now, as if it stood right behind him. Jake spun around, seeing only smoke and trees. He took a deep breath, the smell of blood and phosphorus filling his nose. Was the Mekong jungle cursing them, or was his mind, exhausted by blood and pain, playing tricks? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. His brothers were still fighting, and he wouldn't let them face the darkness alone. Jake tightened his grip on the medical bag, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the roar of approaching air support grew louder. The The storm wasn't over, and the curse in the jungle, real or imagined, was still waiting. The clearing in the heart of the Mekong jungle, May 1968, had become a hellish furnace, where smoke and blood merged into a deadly tableau. The roar of jet engines tore through the sky, napalm and white phosphorus bombs raining down, turning the forest into a sea of fire, trees blazing like torches, white smoke curling upward, burning eyes and lungs. Sergeant Jake Mello, his uniform soaked with blood, knelt beside Ryan O'Neill and Tony, the interpreter fading from blood loss. His hands, caked with dust and blood, trembled as he injected morphine into Ryan, then Tony, and finally himself, the needle piercing his skin like a reminder that he was still alive, if only for now. He tightened the tourniquet on Tony's nearly severed arm, trying to keep him conscious, Tony's dimming eyes a silent plea. Jake wanted to say something comforting, but his throat was parched, managing only a fragile promise that they'd get out. Deep inside, though, he felt his own trembling, as if war had crushed all hope. Fire and smoke engulfed the clearing, but the enemy, like immortal specters, surged again, closer than ever. They burst from the charred tree line, their shouts blending with gunfire, each bullet a knife slashing the air. Jake, with his buck knife at his hip and an empty medical bag, stood, his body heavy as lead. An NVA soldier charged, his face twisted with rage, swinging his AK-47 like a baseball bat, aiming for Jake's head. The blow landed hard, knocking him to his knees, blood streaming from his temple, dripping onto the red earth. The soldier didn't stop, drawing a bayonet and stabbing Jake's forearm, then his stomach, the cold steel tearing flesh. Pain erupted, a fire consuming his consciousness. But Jake roared, a primal bellow, drawing his buck knife with the speed of a man with nothing left to lose. He stabbed, the blade piercing the enemy's chest, the feel of steel hitting bone resonating in his hand. The soldier collapsed, eyes vacant, and Jake, staggering, rose, blood pouring like a river from his new wounds. He had no time to rest. Greyhound 3, the last operational helicopter, swooped into the clearing, its rotors slashing the wind, green smoke from a grenade curling upward like a plea for rescue. Jake dragged Ryan, now a frail shell, and Tony, nearly motionless, toward the cabin. His hands shook, but the will of a Green Beret, forged through countless battles, refused to let him quit. He pushed them aboard where the crew's hands pulled them in, the rotor's roar drowning out war's chaos. But Jake didn't climb up. He turned back, eyes scanning the clearing where other survivors still hid behind tattered bushes. Blood streamed from his stomach and arm, each step a trial, but he couldn't leave anyone behind, not Tom Brady, not any brother. With his remaining strength, Jake crawled across the earth, pulling the wounded toward the chopper. He carried Tony, his body light from blood loss, placing him in the cabin, then flashed a thumbs up to the pilot, a familiar American soldier's gesture, as if saying everything was fine, though the world was crumbling. But as Greyhound 3 lifted off, its rotors thundering, Jake collapsed, his body spent, blood pooling red on the earth. His consciousness faded, leaving only the jungle's whisper, now clearer than ever, like a deathly hymn echoing in his mind. Back at Loch Neen, the base was chaos. Comrades pulled survivors from the helicopter, but when they saw Jake, motionless and bloodied, they shook their heads, thinking him dead. A soldier with calloused hands zipped him into a body bag, the sound of the zipper like a final verdict. But in the stifling darkness of the plastic, Jake, though unable to move, heard the voices around him. "Damn Charlie," one soldier muttered, mistaking him for an enemy. The will to live, like an unquenchable flame, surged within him. With his last ounce of strength, Jake spat, blood and saliva hitting the face of the medic leaning over, a desperate act proving he was still alive. A shout rang out and the body bag was torn open, blinding light flooding in, pulling Jake back from death's edge. On the helicopter ferrying the wounded to the field hospital, Jake lay on a stretcher, his weak hand grasping Ryan's. He wanted to speak, to know if Ryan was okay, but his body was too weary, each breath a battle. Ryan, his face ghostly white, squeezed Jake's hand as if passing a sliver of hope. But then Ryan's grip went slack and Jake felt a cold void spread through him. Ryan was gone, leaving an indescribable pain, as if war had stolen not just lives but fragments of his soul. Jake closed his eyes, images of Ryan, Tom, and other brothers flashing, intertwined with the jungle's whisper. He thought of evenings at Fort Bragg, where they'd joked about who'd win a fantasy football game with John Wayne as referee. Now, those smiles were gone, leaving only smoke and blood. But deep within, Jake felt a strange strength, as if the Mekong, though it cursed them, had granted him a gift, the will to live, to tell this story. He didn't know if the whisper was real or a hallucination, but he knew one thing. He'd fought not just the enemy, but the darkness of war itself, and he'd won, if only for now. In the field hospital room, the smell of antiseptic mingled with the moans of wounded soldiers, creating an atmosphere as heavy as war itself. Sergeant Jake Malone awoke, his body wrapped in bandages, each breath a battle against pain. The dim light from the ceiling bulb pierced his eyelids, but the first image in his mind wasn't this room. It was the blood-soaked, smoke-filled clearing in the Mekong jungle. He thought of Ryan O'Neill, the brother who'd gripped his hand on the stretcher, that hand going limp before the helicopter landed. Jake closed his eyes, his heart heavy, believing Ryan was gone, another name added to the list of those war had stolen. He didn't know that thousands of miles away in Fiji, 12 years later, Ryan was living with the same pain, believing Jake hadn't survived that horrific battle. Time passed and Jake's physical wounds healed, but the scars on his soul remained, deep and indelible. He returned to life, carrying memories of May 2nd, 1968, the day he plunged into the inferno to save his teammates, armed only with a buck knife and a tiny bottle of Tabasco in his pocket. The secret weapon he'd joked made MREs less dreadful. But war wasn't about canned meals or imagined football games at Fort Bragg. It was blood, smoke, and mysteries Jake couldn't explain. He often sat alone, thinking of the deep, hollow whisper in the jungle, the glowing red eyes flashing in the darkness. Was it a hallucination born of stress? Or did the Mekong jungle hide an ancient secret, a curse no one dared name? It wasn't until 1980 that fate reunited Jake and Ryan, if only through words on a page. Ryan, now living a quiet life in Fiji, stumbled across an article from El Campo, Texas, recounting Jake Malone's heroic actions in 1968. He was stunned to learn Jake was alive, but joy quickly turned to outrage when he read that the Army's Decorations Board had denied Jake the Medal of Honor, citing insufficient evidence. Ryan, whom Jake had dragged from the jaws of death, knew he couldn't stay silent. He submitted a detailed testimony recounting every moment of that horrific day, from the gunfire and phosphorus smoke to the image of Jake, bloodied and battered, crawling through the clearing to save his team. Ryan's account, combined with relentless efforts from Jake's family and community, finally persuaded Congress. On February 24, 1981, in a solemn ceremony at the Pentagon, President Ronald Reagan presented Jake with the Medal of Honor, recognizing his courage beyond imagination. Standing on the podium, Jake, his hair now streaked with gray, bowed his head, not for the honor, but for the brothers who couldn't be there. Ryan, Tom Brady, and others, forever left in the Mekong jungle. But Jake Malone's story didn't end with the medal. His daughter, Emily, in a heartfelt letter, revealed another side of her father. A man who was not just a battlefield hero, but a father, a husband, and a devout believer with a boundless heart. Emily shared that Jake always believed something supernatural was in the jungle that day. Dad said he felt a presence watching, as if the jungle had a soul, she wrote. Jake, a lover of John Grisham novels and a quiet presence in church, sensed God's hand, but also something else, a nameless darkness. The whisper he heard, the towering figure with glowing red eyes lurking in the forest, was it a product of an exhausted mind, or a trace of an ancient secret the Mekong held? Jake never found an answer, but he carried the question through life, an invisible scar alongside his physical wounds. Jake lived on, not to boast of glory, but to inspire. He wrote books, spoke to youth, urging them to become future leaders, always stressing that nothing was more precious than courage and camaraderie. He established a scholarship in his name at his high school in El Campo, a way to honor the values he cherished. But in quiet moments, alone with a Grisham novel, or in church, Jake still heard the jungle's whisper, still saw those red eyes in his memory. He wasn't afraid, but he was curious. A Green Beret's curiosity, ever ready to face the darkness. Jake Malone's story is a testament to courage, but also a reminder that war isn't just guns and bombs. Sometimes it carries mysteries beyond human understanding, secrets known only to the jungle and the soldiers who fought there. Was the figure in the forest real, or a mirage of a war-torn mind? No one knows for sure, and perhaps that's what makes this story compelling. If Jake's journey moves you, share it with friends in America who love history, military tales, and unsolved mysteries. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll uncover the truth behind the Mekong's curse, or at least keep Jake's flame of courage burning forever.